Like all bureaucracies and government structures, there is a machine-like quality to the organization and structure of the court system. There's a framework, like the framework of beams and girders, inside every big building. Those beams and girders form the skeleton around which the skyscraper is designed. And so let's look at the skeletal structure, or the org chart, the organizational chart for the federal court system. Now, first off, I didn't even include that. In the attached documents, you're going to see a number of these and a few that aren't here. Let's take a look. Let's see if I can bring this close enough to read. See my high-tech solution? No doubt Mac will have a better idea, and I'm sure he'd be right, but I am low-tech, if nothing else, low-tech. So, the U.S. Supreme Court is at the top. It is the court of last resort. We'll talk of that. Below it are the United States Courts of Appeals. There are different regional U.S. appellate courts, like the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco, which handles decisions for all of the western states, including the Pacific Territories. And below them are the U.S. District Courts, which are part of the appellate system. But that's not all that goes to the Supreme Court. No. There are also state Supreme Courts that have decisions from intermediary appellate courts, which get their decisions from state trial courts. So let me explain how things get bumped up and down the pyramid. If I am accused of a crime and I am found guilty, and I believe that that guilty plea or that guilty conviction is wrong, and it was achieved through a wrongful type of evidence, or that the law has been miscarried, that there's a miscarriage of justice, my lawyer, while I am rotting in prison, will make an appeal to a regional appellate court. For example, if I am convicted in county court or in the local district, the first Idaho judicial district, which includes the Northern Panhandle and Coeur d'Alene, then I can take my appeal up to the level of the state Supreme Court of Idaho. The state Supreme Court can decide whether or not my case was righteously determined. And if they think it wasn't, they can vacate the decision, which is fancy lingo for saying they can overturn my guilty conviction. But if the state Supreme Court overturns my guilty conviction, and the prosecutor, who is the attorney working for the government, dedicated to charging and convicting criminals, they are the attackers in the adversarial system that is our courts. If the prosecutor thinks that overturning my guilty plea is a miscarriage of justice and violates a fundamental thing, they can appeal the decision to the federal court level, in our case, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the most liberal court of appeals in the country, based not as an accident in San Francisco. And then, if they make a decision I don't like or the state doesn't like, we can bump it up all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court does not have to take the case, but if it chooses to take the case, then it may be a precedent for the entire country. But it could say, no, we're going to let the decision of the Ninth Circuit stand, and I've got to live with it. The U.S. Supreme Court has washed its hands and said that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco has made a righteous decision, or at least we're not going to challenge that. If the Ninth Circuit refuses to hear the case, I think that federal appeals courts can decide to or not to hear an appeals case. This is the same sort of thing. But the idea is, if I'm in court and I don't get the decision that I think is just, I have a legal right to take that to another court. It's like I get an opinion from a doctor that I don't like or I don't want, and so I go to another doctor and I get a second opinion. In this case, I'm going up the food chain. I've gone from my local trial court up to the regional or state appellate court, and then to the state Supreme Court, and then up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, because we're in the West, and then up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And at any point, the higher court can say, no, we're going to let the decision stand. But the right to appeal is absolute, especially at the lower levels. So, to say again, trials come from, and decisions come from, the bottom of this pyramid, from state trial courts, regional or state courts, up to the U.S. Supreme Court, or they come from U.S. district courts, U.S. courts of appeals like the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco, and all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. They get bumped up, and the higher courts, especially the Supreme Court, can say the lower court's decision will stand, or we are going to take the case. And if they take the case, that means that they are possibly going to vote the same way, possibly not. It depends on what the justices think. Now, another way of looking at the federal court system is through this chart here, which will also be in attachment. The United States Supreme Court, on the far side over here, deals with the various state court systems. Problems in local court, going up to the state Supreme Court and to the U.S. But there are also special federal courts, like courts for the military. Military court-martials can get bumped up to the U.S. Supreme Court. U.S. district courts and the U.S. appeals courts, they can go. So you can go through the state courts in Idaho, or you can go through the Ninth Circuit. Rarely will you go through both. Usually it's one or the other. And then, of course, there are cases involving a foreign diplomat or government that may get bumped up to the U.S. Supreme Court because of diplomatic immunity. If a Belgian, I'm just picking that nationality out of a hat, United Nations ambassador was a repeat offender drunk driver on the streets of New York City, we would ask for that guy to be removed. But if he killed a bunch of people, it would be hard for him to claim diplomatic immunity if it was like the 7th or 8th time he's been found to be drunk driving. So the U.S. Supreme Court may get involved there. So there's an idea of the structure of the courts and how they work. And I've given you also some indication of those courts that deal with northern Idaho.